My name is Warren Hayes. I'm 52 years old, and the night my father called teaching a career for failures was the same night he turned on his television and saw my face on every major news channel in America. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I sat with it for 30 years. I had spent over 3 decades of my life inside classrooms that smelled like chalk dust and old textbooks, standing in front of teenagers who didn't want to be there, trying to convince them that they mattered. I gave up weekends, I gave up vacations, I gave up money I could have made doing almost anything else. And to my father, the man who raised me, the man whose approval I chased my entire life without ever once catching it, none of it mattered, not one single day of it. When I invited him to the biggest night of my career, the night that would change everything, he didn't hesitate, he didn't even blink. He laughed, that short, dismissive laugh he'd been giving me since I was 17 years old. And he said the words that had been sitting under the surface of every conversation we'd ever had. Teaching is for failures. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. I had spent too many years already defending myself to a man who had already made up his mind about who I was before I ever stood in front of a single student. So I did the only thing I had left to do. I smiled and I said, "I understand." That's all, 4 words, "I understand." He thought that was the end of it. He thought I had finally accepted my place, the disappointing son, the one who settled, the one who couldn't cut it in the real world. He went back to his recliner, back to his television, back to his life of measuring men by the size of their bank accounts. But that same night, my father froze in front of that television. His hands began to shake. The remote slipped right out of his fingers and hit the floor, and he didn't even notice, because the son he had spent decades looking down on, the son he had humiliated at every Thanksgiving table and every birthday dinner for 30 years, was suddenly the biggest story on every news channel in the country. But by then, it was far too late for him to take any of it back. I'm going to tell you the whole story, every year of it. The humiliation, the silence, the sacrifice, and the night everything I had ever built finally spoke for itself when I could not. I'm not going to soften any of it for you, and I'm not going to pretend I've made perfect peace with all of it, because I haven't, not completely, not even now. Some wounds close, some just learn to stop bleeding in front of other people. If stories about family betrayal, quiet perseverance, and unforgettable moments of justice mean something to you, stay with me. And if you feel this story in your chest the way I still feel it in mine, do me a favor, like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to know who's out there listening, because for most of my life, nobody in my own family was. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened. I'm a high school history teacher. I have been one since I was 25 years old, teaching in the same small town I grew up in classrooms that never had enough funding, with textbooks that were sometimes older than the students reading them. I drive a truck with almost 200,000 miles on it. I live in a modest house on the edge of town, the same house my late wife and I bought together when we were young and had nothing but hope in each other. I lost her 6 years ago. Cancer. I won't dwell on that tonight, because that's a different kind of pain, a quieter one, but I want you to know it's there, underneath everything else I'm about to tell you. I live alone now. My evenings are quiet. I grade papers at my kitchen table with the radio on, because the silence in that house can get loud if I let it. I never cared about money. I know how strange that sounds in a world that measures a man's worth by the numbers in his account, but I never wanted a big house or a fast car or a name people whispered with envy. I wanted something else entirely. I wanted to walk into a room and watch a kid who had given up on themselves realize, for the first time, that somebody believed they were capable of more. That feeling watching a struggling 17-year-old stand a little taller because I told them I saw something in them worth fighting for, that feeling was worth more to me than anything my father ever chased his entire life. I believed then, and I believe now, that changing one life is greater than making $1 million. I still believe that, even after everything he put me through, even after 30 years of being told that belief made me a failure. I need you to understand that about me before I tell you the rest, because everything that happened only makes sense if you understand that I never did this for recognition. I never did it to prove anyone wrong. I did it because it was the only thing in this world that ever felt like mine. I want to show you who I was in that classroom, because it's easy to say I was a good teacher and have it mean nothing. Words are cheap. My father taught me that lesson better than anyone, even if he didn't mean to. There was a girl, I won't use her real name, but I think about her often, who came to me in her junior year with a stack of unpaid fees threatening to keep her off the honors track. Her family didn't have it. I did. It wasn't much, not to me, but it was everything to her. I paid it quietly, the way I paid for a lot of things over the years, because the moment you make a kindness about yourself, it stops being a kindness. There were the Tuesday and Thursday afternoons I stayed too, sometimes 3 hours past the final bell, tutoring kids who were drowning in material nobody had ever slowed down long enough to actually teach them. Nobody paid me for those hours. I didn't want to be paid for them. I wanted those kids to walk into a test with their shoulders back instead of their eyes down. There was the year I spent nearly $4,000 of my own salary on classroom supplies because the school budget had been cut again, and I refused to let my students sit in a room with broken desks and no working pencils while the county spent money on things that mattered less than they did. There were the letters. God, there were the letters. Former students, years later, writing to tell me that I was the reason they applied for scholarship they didn't think they deserved, the reason they didn't drop out their senior year, the reason they walked across a graduation stage at all. I have a drawer full of those letters. I have read every single one of them more times than I can count, especially on the nights my father's voice was louder in my head than it had any right to be. There were the young teachers, fresh out of college, terrified and exhausted, who I sat with after school just to tell them it gets easier, to show them how to reach the kid in the back row who'd already decided school wasn't for them. I mentored them quietly, never for credit, never for a title, just because somebody needed to. I remember a boy in my 3rd year of teaching, angry at the whole world in a way that 17-year-olds sometimes are without fully understanding why. He failed every test I gave him for the first 2 months of the semester. He didn't talk in class. He didn't do homework. Every other teacher in that building had already written him off, filed him away as a lost cause, somebody to get through the year with rather than somebody to actually teach. I didn't do that. I stayed after school with him 3 days a week for months, not because I thought he'd suddenly become a straight-A student, but because I believed, the way I believed about every single kid who ever sat in my classroom, that nobody is a lost cause at 17 years old. By the spring, he was passing. By graduation, he had a partial scholarship to a state school nobody in his family had ever attended. Years later, he sent me a photograph of his own daughter, and on the back, he'd written 4 words, "Because you didn't quit." I keep that photograph in the same drawer as the letters. I remember a girl who came to school with bruises she tried to hide under long sleeves, even in the middle of summer heat. I noticed. I made the calls I was required to make, the calls that changed the direction of her entire life, the calls that got her somewhere safe. She doesn't know, to this day, how many nights I lay awake wondering if I'd done the right thing, if I'd done enough, if there was more I should have seen sooner. That's not the kind of thing that makes the news either. That's not the kind of thing you can put a dollar value on, the kind of thing my father would ever understand as success. But I would trade every ounce of the recognition I received that night on that stage for the certainty that she is safe today, still, all these years later. I remember dozens of kids like them. Hundreds, honestly, across 30 years. Faces I still see clearly when I close my eyes. Names I could recite without hesitation even now. Every single one of them mattered more to me than any number my father ever respected, any contract my brother ever signed, any measurement of success that fits neatly into a bank statement. None of that ever made the news. None of that ever earned me a seat at my father's table where I was treated like an equal. But it was real. It was 30 years of real, quiet, unglamorous work that changed actual human lives, one at a time, while my father sat in his recliner and called it a career for failures. And then, out of nowhere, everything changed. I was selected for one of the highest national teaching honors in this country. I want you to understand, I didn't campaign for this. I didn't submit myself. A former student, now grown, now successful, had nominated me years earlier without my knowledge. And somehow, through a process I still don't fully understand, my name rose to the top of a list of thousands of educators across America. The awards ceremony would be televised live, nationwide. News organizations were covering inspiring educators from every corner of the country, and I was one of them. I was invited to deliver a nationally broadcast acceptance speech, standing in front of people whose names I'd only ever seen on television, in front of cameras that would carry my voice into millions of homes. I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride, exactly, something closer to disbelief. 30 years of quiet work, and somebody somewhere had finally noticed. I stayed humble about it. I didn't call anyone bragging. I didn't post it everywhere. I simply felt, for the first time in a long time, like maybe my life's work had mattered beyond the walls of my classroom. And the very first thing I thought, the very first impulse in my chest was, I want my family there. I want my father to see this. I know how that sounds now, looking back. I know some of you are already shaking your heads at me, already saying, Warren, why did you still want that man's approval after everything? And the honest answer is, I don't fully know. I think some part of a son never stops wanting his father to be proud of him, no matter how old that son gets, no matter how many times he's been told he isn't good enough. I was 58 years old, and I still wanted my father to look at me the way he looked at my brother, so I called them. I called every single one of them. Let me tell you about my family, because you need to understand exactly what I was up against. My father built a career in commercial real estate. He made real money, the kind of money that buys silence and respect in certain rooms. He has spent his entire life believing that the only careers worth respecting are the ones that make a man wealthy. Doctors, if they're the right kind. Lawyers, if they win. Businessmen always, teachers never. To him, teaching wasn't a profession. It was what people did when they couldn't do anything else. He never said it once. He said it constantly in 100 different ways across 3 decades. Every family dinner had a version of it. Every holiday had a comment about my brother's new truck or his newest contract, followed by a long, pointed silence when it was my turn to share anything about my life. He would ask me how the little school thing was going, in the same tone you'd use to ask a child about a hobby. My mother is a quiet woman. She loves me, I know that, I've never doubted that. But she has spent 40 years married to a man who does not tolerate disagreement, and somewhere along the way, her love for me got folded into a silence she never broke. She would squeeze my hand under the table when my father said something cruel. She would call me the next day to check on me, but she never once, not once in 30 years, told him to stop. And then there's my younger brother. He owns a successful construction company, and he built it into something genuinely impressive. I'll give him that. I've always given him that. But somewhere in his success, he absorbed every single one of my father's beliefs about what makes a man worth respecting. He mocked my income more times than I can count. He made jokes about my truck, about my house, about the fact that I was 58 years old and still grabbing papers at a kitchen table instead of running something, building something, being something. He never saw me as his brother. He saw me as a cautionary tale. That was the family I called the week of the ceremony. That was the family I invited to watch me stand on a national stage and be honored for a life's work they had spent decades telling me was worthless. I want to be clear about something, because I don't want you to walk away from this story thinking I hated them even back then. Hate would have almost been simpler. Hate you can name, hate you can point to, hate gives you somewhere to put all that pain so it stops rattling around loose inside your chest. What I felt toward my family for most of my life wasn't hate. Something closer to grief, the grief of loving people who were never going to love you back in the shape you needed them to. I kept showing up at those dinner tables. I kept inviting them to things. I kept calling on birthdays and holidays and every ordinary Sunday in between, not because I expected them to change, but because some stubborn, aching part of me refused to stop hoping they might, even after 30 years of evidence telling me otherwise. That's its own kind of exhausting. Loving people who won't meet you halfway is its own kind of full-time job, and I worked it for 3 decades without ever once being paid in the currency I actually needed. I called my father first. I told him about the honor. I told him it would be televised nationally, that news crews from every major network would be there, that I had been asked to give a speech in front of educators and dignitaries from across the country. I told him in a voice I tried very hard to keep steady that I wanted him there. He laughed. I will never forget that laugh as long as I live. It wasn't cruel exactly, that's what made it worse. It was easy, effortless, like the idea of me being honored for anything was so absurd it didn't even require thought. Teaching is for failures, he said, just like that. The same sentence he'd been carrying around in his back pocket for 30 years, finally spent on the one moment I had hoped, foolishly, might be different. No one's giving awards for writing on chalkboards, he added, and I heard the television in the background, some sports game, and I understood in that moment exactly where I ranked in his evening, somewhere below whatever was on that screen. I called my brother next, because some part of me, some stupid, hopeful part of me, thought maybe he'd surprise me. He didn't. Not wasting my evening watching teachers clap for each other, he told me, and I could hear him doing something else while he said it, distracted, already moving on to whatever mattered more to him. I called my mother last. She was gentler about it, the way she always was. She said she'd see what happens, that she'd try to make it work, that she wasn't sure what my father had planned. I knew, even as she said it, that she would never commit to anything my father hadn't already approved of. I knew that "we'll see" was just a softer way of saying no. It always had been 3 phone calls, 3 rejections, 30 years of quiet humiliation distilled into a single week, right before the most important night of my professional life. Each one cut deeper than the last, and I want to be honest with you about that, because I think too many people pretend these things don't hurt just because they've heard them before. It doesn't get easier to hear your father call your life's work a failure just because he said it 100 times before. It gets heavier. Every single time, it gets heavier. I sat in my kitchen that night after those 3 calls, and I want to tell you exactly what that felt like, because I don't think people who haven't lived it can fully understand. It's not one big wound. It's not a single blow you can point to and say, "That's where it happened, that's where it broke." It's 1,000 small cuts, layered on top of each other for 30 years, until you don't even bleed anymore. You just carry the scar tissue around with you, and every so often, someone presses right on top of it, and you feel it all over again like it was the very first time. I thought about every version of myself that had tried to earn that man's approval. The 17-year-old who thought good grades might do it. The 25-year-old who thought his first classroom might do it. The 35-year-old who thought a stack of thank you letters from students might finally be enough evidence. The 45-year-old standing at my wife's funeral, watching my father shake hands with the other mourners like he was working a room instead of grieving alongside his son. Every single version of me had tried. Every single version of me had failed to move him, because the truth I didn't want to admit for most of my life was this: it was never about me proving anything. It was about a man who had already decided, before I was even born, what kind of son would make him proud. And I was never going to be that son, no matter what I built, because I built it in a language he refused to learn how to read. That anger sat in me for years, quiet and controlled, dressed up as patience. I told myself I had made peace with it. I hadn't. I had just gotten very, very good at hiding it, even from myself. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing peace you don't actually feel. You smile at the family dinner. You laugh at the joke that cuts you open a little more every time you hear it. You tell yourself you're being the bigger man, the mature one, the one who doesn't let it get to him, and all the while, underneath that calm exterior, something is quietly accumulating, year after year, dinner after dinner, until one day you realize you've been carrying a weight so heavy you've forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight without it. That was me for 30 years, calm on the outside, carrying something enormous on the inside that nobody in my family ever once asked me to put down. But here's what I did with all of that weight. I smiled. I know that sounds impossible, but I mean it. Somewhere in the years of hearing that man tell me who I wasn't, I had built something inside myself that he could no longer touch, not because it didn't hurt, but because I had stopped needing him to be the one who told me my life mattered. I said I understand to every single one of them. No arguments, no pleading, no trying to explain one more time why what I did with my life had value. I hung up the phone each time without raising my voice. And I want you to understand something about that silence, because it wasn't weakness. It wasn't me accepting defeat. It was 30 years of practice. It was a wall I had built brick by brick, humiliation by humiliation, until I no longer needed his permission to know who I was. But underneath that calm, I promise you, there was a fire. There was anger sitting so deep in my chest it had turned into something almost cold, something patient. I had spent 3 decades being told I settled for less. 3 decades of watching my brother's success paraded in front of me like proof of my own inadequacy. 3 decades of biting my tongue at dinner tables while my father explained again why real men made real money. And now, for the first time, The world outside my family was about to tell a very different story about who I was, and they weren't even going to be in the room to hear it. The days leading up to the ceremony moved in two completely different directions, and I think about that contrast more than almost anything else from that time. I traveled to the ceremony a few days early. I met other educators, remarkable people, teachers from inner cities and rural towns just like mine, people who had spent their careers doing exactly what I had done, pouring themselves into children nobody else had time for. I sat in rooms with people who understood, without me having to explain it, why I had given up so much money and so much comfort for a job that broke my heart and rebuilt it in the same week, over and over again, for 30 years. I practiced my acceptance speech in a hotel room by myself, reading it out loud to an empty room the way I used to read lessons out loud to an empty classroom before the students arrived each morning. I revised it a dozen times. I wanted it to be honest. I didn't want to talk about awards or cameras or headlines. I wanted to talk about the kids. I always wanted to talk about the kids. I thought about 30 years of sacrifice. I thought about my late wife, who used to tell me on the hardest nights that what I did mattered even when it didn't feel like it. I thought about every letter in that drawer at home. I thought, more than I wanted to admit, about my father, and some small, stubborn, aching part of me still hoped that maybe he would show up anyway. Maybe he'd surprise me the way I always hoped he would and never did. Meanwhile, back home, my family went on with an ordinary evening. My father settled into his recliner. My brother went about his usual routine, wrapped up in whatever mattered more to him that week. They ate dinner. They watched sports. As far as I could tell, and as far as I later confirmed, not one of them gave a single thought to what I was doing that night, or where I was, or what I was about to become in front of the entire country. They had completely forgotten. Or maybe, more painfully, they simply hadn't thought it was worth remembering in the first place. I want to take you back further, because I think you need to understand where all of this started, why my father hated the word teacher so much that it curdled into contempt every time it came out of his mouth. When I was young, my father believed that money was the only honest measurement of a man's worth. That belief wasn't an opinion to him, it was gospel. He had grown up with very little, and he had clawed his way into wealth through sheer force of will, and somewhere in that climb, he decided that anyone who didn't chase the same path had simply chosen to be less than him. I loved learning. Even as a boy, I loved it in a way that felt almost embarrassing in my house, where the only conversations that seemed to matter were about deals and contracts and money changing hands. I used to read history books under my blankets with a flashlight. I used to ask my teachers questions after class just because I wanted to know more, not because it would be on a test. And when I told my father at 17 years old that I wanted to become a teacher, I watched something in his face close like a door. He didn't yell. That would have almost been easier. He just looked at me with an expression I would spend the rest of my life trying to forget, and he said, "You're better than that," in a tone that made it very clear he didn't believe it. He believed the opposite. He believed teaching was beneath me, beneath our family, beneath the future he had already decided I should want. Every family gathering after that included some version of a joke about my career. My father would introduce me to his business associates as my son, the teacher, with a pause before the word that told everyone in the room exactly how to feel about it. He compared me constantly to men who had made something of themselves. He compared me endlessly, relentlessly to my brother. I endured decades of that. Quiet humiliation, dressed up as concern, dressed up as jokes, dressed up as fatherly disappointment that never once considered that maybe, just maybe, his son had built something real out of a life he didn't understand. I remember one Thanksgiving in particular, maybe 15 years ago, when my brother had just closed a contract on a new development downtown. My father spent the entire dinner talking about it, glowing with a pride I had never once seen him direct at me. And when the conversation finally turned my way, when someone at the table, an aunt, I think, someone who didn't know any better, asked how my school year was going, my father cut in before I could even answer. "Warren's still playing teacher," he said, and the table laughed, not cruelly, just the easy kind of laughter that comes from people who have heard a joke so many times they don't even register it as an insult anymore. I laughed too. I want you to know that. I sat at that table and I laughed along with them, because that was easier than showing anyone in that room what those words actually cost me. I want you to understand something about humiliation like that. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with warning. It slides into a conversation dressed as a joke, and you're expected to laugh. And if you don't laugh, if you dare to say it hurts, you become the problem. You become too sensitive. You become the one who can't take a joke. So you learn over years and years to swallow it. You learn to smile through it. And every single time you swallow it, a little piece of you goes somewhere dark and stays there, waiting. I have that darkness in me. I won't pretend I don't. 30 years of a father who measured my worth in numbers I never had. 30 years of a brother who saw my modest life as proof of his own superiority. 30 years of a mother whose love for me never once translated into the courage to defend me that builds something in a person. It builds a quiet, cold kind of anger that doesn't scream, doesn't rage, doesn't break dishes against a wall. It just waits. It waits for the moment when the truth can no longer be laughed away, when the humiliation can no longer be dismissed as a joke, when the whole world is watching and there's nowhere left for anyone to hide from what they've done. I want you to hold on to that, because it's the reason the ending of this story matters as much as it does. This wasn't just one bad phone call before one important night. This was 30 years of a man refusing to see me. 30 years of a father who never once asked a single student's name, never once asked what it felt like to watch a struggling kid succeed, never once wondered what I actually did with the hours of my life he considered wasted. The night of the ceremony finally arrived, and I remember every detail of it with a clarity that still surprises me. The venue was more beautiful than anything I had ever stood inside. Distinguished guests filled the room, leaders in education from every state, people whose research and policy work had shaped classrooms across the country. Television crews moved through the space with practiced efficiency, setting up cameras that would carry this night into homes across America. Fellow educators came up to me all evening, shaking my hand, telling me they had read about my work, telling me my story had moved them. I felt something that night I hadn't let myself feel in a long time, the sense that maybe I belonged somewhere, that maybe the life I had built mattered exactly as much as I had always privately believed it did, even when nobody in my own family would say so. My nerves grew as the night went on. Not because I doubted my speech, but because some old, familiar part of me kept scanning the room, kept checking the entrance, kept hopping. I know how foolish that sounds. I was 58 years old, about to be honored on a national stage, and I was still checking the door for a father who had told me in no uncertain terms that he wasn't coming. Their seats, the ones I had reserved just in case, just in the smallest, most stubborn corner of hope I had left, remained empty the entire night. I want to be honest with you about how that felt. It felt like being 17 years old again, standing in that living room, watching my father's face close like a door. 30 years later, on the most important night of my career, and I was still that same boy, still hoping the door might open one more time. It didn't. I kept glancing toward those 3 empty chairs throughout the evening, even while I was shaking hands with people who mattered, even while photographers asked me to smile for pictures that would run in newspapers the next morning. I couldn't help it. Some habits get carved into you so deep they survive every ounce of success you build on top of them. I had spent 30 years glancing toward doorways that never opened, and one national award wasn't enough to undo 3 decades of that particular kind of hope. A woman sitting near me, another honoree, a teacher from a small town not unlike mine, noticed me looking. She didn't ask directly. Teachers are good at reading a room, at reading a face, at knowing when a question would do more harm than good. She just reached over and squeezed my hand once, briefly, the way you'd reassure a student who was about to walk into a test they were nervous about. She didn't know my story. She didn't need to. She recognized something in my face that every person who has ever loved someone who couldn't love them back the same way would recognize instantly. I sat up a little straighter after that. I told myself the empty chairs didn't matter, that I hadn't built 30 years of my life waiting for 3 people to finally show up for one evening, that the room full of strangers rising to their feet for me meant more than 3 familiar faces choosing, once again, not to be there. I told myself all of that, and some of it, by the time my name was finally called, I had almost started to believe. The ceremony began, and I remember the lights, the way they seemed to swallow the entire room in white heat, the way the cameras felt like they were looking directly into whatever part of me still hoped for approval I had never been given. Millions of people were watching. I didn't fully understand that number until I was standing in front of it. When my name was called, I received a standing ovation before I had even said a single word. A room full of strangers rising to their feet for a man they had only just learned about, a man whose own father wouldn't cross town to see him. My story was shared with the country that night. The paid exam fees, the free tutoring, the classroom supplies bought out of my own pocket, the letters from students whose lives had turned because someone had finally believed in them. Multiple news networks picked up the story as it happened live in real time, because it turns out that a small-town teacher who spent 30 years giving everything he had to children nobody else fought for is exactly the kind of story this country still has room to be moved by. I stood there under those lights, and I understood, really understood, for the first time, that this was bigger than a single award. This was bigger than one ceremony in one city. This was going into homes across America, homes where fathers and mothers and children were watching, and somewhere out there, in a house I knew better than any other house on earth, a television was on. Back home, my father was in his recliner. It was just an ordinary evening to him, dinner finished, the television turned to something meaningless, the kind of night he'd had 1,000 times before without a single thought of me in it. And then he changed the channel. I wasn't there, obviously. I didn't see his face in that exact moment, but I know that man. I know exactly what his living room looked like, exactly how he sat, exactly the particular way he held the remote like it was an extension of his own hand. And I have imagined that moment so many times since that I feel like I was standing right there in the room with him. Every major news channel was covering the ceremony. He couldn't have escaped it if he tried. He flipped from one channel to another, the way he always did when he was bored, and instead of finding something else, he found me. Over and over again, on every single station, he found me, my face, my name, a headline calling me one of the most inspiring educators in the entire country, I'm told, because my mother told me later, in a voice still shaking from the memory of it, that my father froze. That the remote slipped right out of his hand and hit the floor, and he didn't even reach down to pick it up. That his confident, dismissive, 30 years practiced smile disappeared from his face and did not come back. The son he had spent decades looking down on. The son he had called a failure to his face just days earlier. The son whose career he had mocked at every holiday table for 30 straight years. That son was the biggest story in America that night, and my father was watching it happen from a recliner in a living room he had never once let me feel welcome enough to bring my own achievements into. I wasn't there to see his face. But God, some nights, I still imagine it. I imagine the exact second his brain caught up to what his eyes were seeing. I imagine the confusion first, that flicker of disbelief, the assumption that maybe it was a mistake, a different Warren Hayes, some coincidence his mind reached for because the alternative was too enormous to accept in an instant. I imagine him leaning forward in that recliner, the way he used to lean forward when he was studying a contract for a mistake he intended to exploit. Except this time, there was no mistake to find, no angle to work, no way to argue his way out of what was right there on the screen in front of him. I imagine the moment the confusion turned into something else, something heavier. I imagine him hearing the anchor say my name, correctly, clearly, followed by words like extraordinary, inspiring, one of the most dedicated educators this country has produced, words that had never once, not a single time in 58 years, come out of his own mouth about me. I imagine him sitting there while an entire nation said, in one unified voice, the thing he had spent 3 decades refusing to say. And I imagine that silence in his living room being the loudest sound he had ever heard. I don't know if he cried. My mother never told me that part, and I never asked. Some things I think I'll let stay private, even in a story I'm telling the whole world. But I know this, a man like my father doesn't sit frozen in front of a television for something small. A man like my father doesn't let a remote slip out of his hand and stay on the floor for something that doesn't shake him to his foundation. Whatever happened in that living room that night, it was real. It was 30 years of certainty collapsing in the space of a single news segment. And somewhere in that collapse, I still hope, even now, that he finally understood what it had cost me to keep smiling every single time he told me who I was. I gave my speech that night, and I want to tell you what I said, because it wasn't about him. It was never about him, not really, even if some tangled, wounded part of me hoped he'd hear it. I talked about every student who ever believed in themselves for the first time because somebody finally gave them a reason to. I talked about every teacher across this country working late into the evening for no extra pay, no recognition, no headlines, just because a child in their classroom needed them to stay. I talked about the power of education to reach into a life that's been written off by everyone else and rewrite what that life is allowed to become. I did not mention my father's name. I did not talk about the pain of that week, or the phone calls, or 30 years of being told I had settled for less. I stood on that stage and I gave those words to the people who actually deserved them, the students, the teachers, the families who had shown up for each other in ways my own family never showed up for me. The room rose to its feet again when I finished. A second standing ovation, and I remember standing there thinking that this was the strangest kind of vindication. Not loud, not angry, not the confrontation some part of me had spent years secretly rehearsing in my head. Just quiet, overwhelming proof, delivered to millions of strangers, that everything I had given my life to had been worth giving. My story spread online within hours. People I had never met were sharing it, commenting on it, telling me their own stories about teachers who had changed their lives. For one night, the world decided that what I had built actually mattered. And back home, my family was only just beginning to understand what they had missed. The calls started almost immediately. My father called first. I didn't answer, not out of spite, not exactly, but because I honestly didn't know what to say to him yet. I was still standing backstage in a suit that didn't quite fit right, still holding an award heavier than I expected, still trying to process the fact that millions of people now knew my name, while the three people who were supposed to know it best had chosen, deliberately, not to be there. He called again, and again. Then the texts started, one after another, each one a little more frantic than the last. Then the voicemails, I listened to those later, alone in my hotel room, and I heard something in his voice I had never once heard in 58 years. I heard fear. I heard a man who suddenly understood all at once exactly what he had spent decades throwing away. My mother called too, and when I finally answered her, I could hear that she'd been crying. Not performative tears, not the kind meant to guilt me into forgiveness, real tears. The kind that come from a woman finally facing 30 years of silence she had let sit between us. My brother called as well, and I could hear it in his voice too, that particular kind of disbelief that comes from watching something you were certain you understood turn out to be something else entirely. He had spent years measuring my worth in dollars. He was watching, in real time, the entire country measure it differently. They desperately wanted me to answer. And for the first time in my life, I understood something about power that I had never had access to before. For 30 years, my family had controlled when I mattered and when I didn't. That night, for the first time, I got to decide. I sat in that hotel room and I watched my phone light up over and over, and I want to describe exactly what that felt like, because it wasn't the triumphant, satisfying feeling you might expect from a story like this. It was strange. It was almost disorienting. For 30 years, my phone rarely rang from that number unless my father wanted something, or wanted to remind me, in some small offhand way, of exactly where I stood in the family's estimation of what mattered. And now that same number was calling me over and over, and for once, I was the one with something he wanted. I thought about answering just to hear what he'd say. I thought about letting him sit in that discomfort a little longer, the way he'd let me sit in mine for 3 decades. I thought about 100 different things sitting in that room alone, with an award on the nightstand and a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. In the end, I didn't answer out of any grand strategy. I didn't answer because I was still processing what had just happened to me, because the enormity of the night hadn't fully settled into my chest yet, and I didn't have room in me yet for whatever my father needed to say. I turned my phone face down on the nightstand, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let it ring without feeling obligated to fix how he felt about it. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit there for a while, not out of cruelty, though I won't pretend there wasn't some small, aching satisfaction in it. I let it sit because I needed it. I needed one night where I didn't have to manage my father's feelings about who I was. I needed one night to just be the man the entire country had just spent an evening honoring, without immediately folding myself back into the smaller, disappointing version of myself my family had always seen. The next day they came to see me. I remember opening my front door and finding all 3 of them standing there, my father, my mother, my brother, none of them quite meeting my eyes at first, all 3 of them looking like people who had spent the night rearranging everything they thought they knew. My father spoke first, and I want you to understand what it costs a man like him to say what he said. He is not a man who apologizes. He is not a man who admits fault, not to his wife, not to his sons, not to anyone. But he stood in my doorway, and in a voice quieter than I had ever heard from him, he said, "I never realized how wrong I was." 5 words. 30 years undone by 5 words that came about 30 years too late. My brother stood behind him, and I watched something shift across his face too, the discomfort of a man realizing he had spent years measuring success with the wrong ruler entirely. "I judged you by what you made," he said, and he couldn't quite finish the sentence, couldn't quite say out loud what that judgment had cost the both of us. My mother said the least, but her words landed the hardest, because they were the ones I had been waiting the longest to hear. "I should have said something," she told me. "All those years, I should have said something." She apologized for the silence, for every dinner table she had let go unchallenged, for every moment she had chosen peace with my father over standing up for her own son. I stood there and listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw the last 30 years back in their faces, even though God knows I had every right to. I just listened, the way I had learned to listen to hundreds of students over the years, with patience, and with the understanding that people sometimes need to say things out loud before they can actually mean them. But I want to be honest with you, because I promised you this story straight, with all its ugliness intact. Some part of me, standing in that doorway, wanted to make them feel every single year of it. Some part of me wanted to list every joke at every dinner table, every dismissive laugh, every year my father introduced me with that pause before the word teacher, like it was something shameful. Some part of me wanted to ask my brother if his trucks and his contracts had ever once changed a child's entire future the way a single conversation in my classroom had changed dozens of them. Some part of me wanted to ask my mother how many years of silence it takes before silence becomes its own kind of cruelty. I didn't say any of it, not because I had forgiven them in that moment. I hadn't, not fully, not yet, but because I understood something standing there that I don't think I could have understood a week earlier. Their apology wasn't for me to weaponize. It was theirs to sit with, theirs to carry, theirs to understand the true weight of on their own terms. I had spent 30 years wanting them to see me. Now that they finally did, I wasn't going to spend that moment making them suffer for the years they hadn't. That's not who I built myself to be, sitting in classrooms for 3 decades. Teaching kids that the measure of a person is what they do with their pain, not how loudly they make others pay for causing it. That didn't mean the anger disappeared. It didn't mean the years came back and rewrote themselves into something kinder. It just meant I had a choice, standing in that doorway, about what kind of man I was going to be in the one moment I had waited my whole life for. And I chose, finally, to be exactly the man I had always been, the one they never bothered to notice. And then I told them the truth, all of it, because they had finally earned the right to hear it plainly. I told them that for years, I wasn't trying to prove that teaching was important. I already knew it was important. I didn't need a national award to tell me that the work I did mattered. I had 30 years of letters in a drawer at home that told me that every single day. I told them I was simply trying to prove that every child deserves someone who believes in them. That's all it ever was. That's the whole of it. Every exam fee I paid, every free tutoring session, every dollar I spent on supplies out of my own pocket, none of it was about status or recognition. It was about giving kids something I had spent my whole life wishing somebody had given me a little more of. And then I said the part that had been sitting in my chest for 30 years, the part I had never let myself say out loud to any of them until that exact moment. I told them I only wished my own family had believed in me the same way. The room went silent after that. Not an angry silence, not a defensive one, a silence that comes from people finally understanding the actual size of what they'd cost someone. I watched my father's face in that silence, and for the first time in my entire life, I watched him understand, really understand, the weight of what he had said to me over and over for 30 straight years. He didn't say anything else that day. He didn't need to. I could see it settling into him, the way certain truths only settle once they've been said plainly, without anger, without a fight, just laid bare on a doorstep by a son who had finally stopped protecting him from the cost of his own words. I went back to my classroom the following Monday. I want to tell you about that morning, because as much as that award mattered, as much as that ceremony mattered, as much as the sight of my father's face, finally understanding who I was mattered, none of it came close to walking back into that classroom. My students had heard, of course. Everyone had heard by then, and when I walked through that door, they didn't just sit quietly at their desks the way they normally did on a Monday morning. They stood up, they applauded. Some of them had made handwritten thank you notes, folded up and taped to my desk, little messages from 17-year-olds who had never once cared whether their teacher was famous, because to them, I had always mattered exactly this much. I stood in front of that room, in front of those kids, and I felt something settle in my chest that no television camera, no national broadcast, no standing ovation from strangers had ever given me. I felt like I was exactly where I belonged. Because here is the truth I want to leave you with tonight, the truth that took me 30 years and one very public, very painful reckoning to fully understand. No award, no television broadcast, no headline with my name in it could ever equal the privilege of helping young people build brighter futures. That was never the point. It was never about proving my father wrong. It was never about the applause, the cameras, the frozen look on his face when he finally saw what he had spent 30 years refusing to see. The greatest success isn't measured by wealth or status. It's measured by the lives you change. And sometimes, the people who doubted you the most only recognize your worth after the whole world already has. My father finally saw me that night. But I want you to know something, because I think it matters more than his apology ever could. I didn't need him to see me anymore. I had already spent 30 years being seen by the people who mattered most, my students, my late wife, the graduates who wrote me letters, the young teachers I mentored quietly, the children whose lives quietly, permanently changed, because I refused to give up on them the way my own father had so easily given up on me. That was always enough. It just took the whole country agreeing with me before my own father was finally willing to believe it too. I think about that a lot, actually, how strange it is that it took millions of strangers, people who will never know my name past this week, people who will forget this story the moment the next one comes along, to accomplish something my own father should have been capable of doing with nothing more than a little attention and a little love. It shouldn't have taken a national broadcast. It shouldn't have taken cameras and headlines and a standing ovation from a room full of people who owed me nothing. A father is supposed to see his son without needing the rest of the world to point him in the right direction first. Mine didn't, and I have had to make peace with the fact that some of that time, those 30 years, are simply gone. No apology, however sincere, however overdue, gives them back to me. I'm not angry anymore in the way I used to be angry, the kind that used to sit in my chest at every holiday dinner, that used to tighten my jaw every time he introduced me with that little pause before the word teacher. That anger has changed shape over the years. It's quieter now. It's less about him and more about every child who ever sat in a classroom feeling exactly the way I felt at that dinner table, unseen, unheard, measured by a ruler that was never built to fit them. That's the anger I still carry. That's the anger that gets me out of bed every single school morning, even now, even after everything. Because here's what I know for certain, after 58 years and 30 of them spent inside a classroom, the world is full of fathers who mistake money for meaning, who mistake status for substance, who spend their whole lives climbing something and never once look down to see who they left behind on the way up. I refuse to be that. I refuse to let what happened to me happen to one more child who walks into my classroom feeling like they don't measure up to somebody else's idea of success. My father apologized. My brother apologized. My mother apologized. I accepted all of it, because holding on to that bitterness forever would have cost me something I wasn't willing to lose, the part of myself that still believes people can change, even the ones who take 30 years to do it. But I want to be honest with you about something before I go. Forgiveness doesn't erase the years. It doesn't undo the dinner tables, the jokes, the silence, the empty seats at the biggest night of my career. It just means I've decided not to let his failure become the whole story of my life. The whole story of my life is still being written in a classroom, 5 days a week, by a man who never needed a national award to know his work mattered, just 3 people who finally figured it out a little too late. If this story reached something in you tonight, I hope you'll carry a piece of it with you. Look at the people in your life who quietly give everything they have and rarely ask for anything back. Tell them it matters. Tell them now. Don't wait for the news to tell you first. I think back sometimes to that 17-year-old boy standing in his father's living room, hearing a door close in his father's expression for the very first time. I wish I could go back and tell him something. I wish I could tell him that the door closing in that room was never actually about him. It was about a man too small in his own understanding of the world to see what was standing right in front of him. I wish I could tell him that 30 years from now, he would stand on a stage in front of millions of people, and none of it would erase the pain of that living room, but all of it would prove, beyond any doubt, that his father had been wrong the entire time. I can't go back and tell him that. But I can tell you, whoever you are, watching this tonight, carrying some version of that same living room around in your own chest. If somebody in your life has already decided what you're capable of, if somebody has already measured you and found you wanting, using a ruler that was never built to fit who you actually are, you don't have to spend 30 years waiting for them to notice. Build the life anyway. Help the people anyway. Do the quiet, unglamorous work anyway, whether or not it ever makes the news, whether or not the people who should be proudest of you ever manage to say so. Because eventually, one way or another, the truth finds its way into the room. Sometimes it takes a national broadcast, sometimes it just takes time, but it finds its way there. And when it does, you'll already know what I had to learn the hard way over 30 long years. You were never the failure. You were simply surrounded by people who couldn't see far enough to recognize what they had. My name is Warren Hayes. I'm 52 years old, and I am not, and never was, a failure.